Chapter 2 of Farewell to Nicola by Guy Boothby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. Whether it was our excursion upon the canal that was responsible for it, I cannot say. The fact, however, remains that the next morning every member of our party was late for breakfast. My wife and I were the first to put in an appearance. Glenbarth followed shortly after, and Miss Trevor was last of all. It struck me that the girl looked a little pale as she approached the window to bid me good morning, and as she prided herself upon her punctuality, I jestingly reproved her for the late rising. "I'm afraid your gondola excursion proved too much for you," I said in a bantering tone, "or perhaps you dreamt of Dr Nicola." I expected her to declare in her usual vehement fashion that she would not waste her time dreaming of any man, but to my combined astonishment and horror, her eyes filled with tears until she was compelled to turn her head away in order to hide them from me. It was all so unexpected that I did not know what to think. As may be supposed, I had not the slightest intention of giving her pain, nor could I quite see how I managed to do so. It was plain, however, that my thoughtless speech had been the means of upsetting her, and I was heartily sorry for my indiscretion. Fortunately, my wife had not overheard what had passed between us. "Is he teasing you again, Gertrude?" she said, as she slipped her arm through her friend's. "Take my advice and have nothing to do with him. Treat him with contempt. Besides, the coffee is getting cold, and that is a very much more important matter. Let us sit down to breakfast." Nothing could have been more opportune. We took our places at the table, and by the time the servant had handed the first dishes, Miss Trevor had recovered herself sufficiently to be able to look me in the face and to join in the conversation without the likelihood of a catastrophe. Still, there can be no doubt she was far from being in a happy frame of mind. I said as much to my wife afterwards when we were alone together. "She told me she had a very bad night," the little woman replied. "Our meeting with Dr Nicola yesterday on the piazza upset her for some reason or another. She said that she dreamt of nothing else. As you know, she is very highly strung, and when you think of the descriptions we have given her of him, it is scarcely to be wondered that she should attach an exaggerated importance to our unexpected meeting with him. That is the real explanation of the mystery. One thing, however, is quite certain. In her present state of mind she must see no more of him than could be helped. It might upset her altogether. Oh, why did he come here to spoil our holiday?" "I cannot see that he has spoilt it, my dear," I returned, putting my arm round her waist and leading her to the window. "The girl will very soon recover from her fit of depression, and afterwards will be as merry as a marriage bell. By the way, I don't know why I should think of it just now. Talking of marriage bells reminds me that Glenbarth told me last night that he thought Gertrude one of the nicest girls he had ever met." "I am delighted to hear it," my wife answered, "and still more delighted to think that he had such a good sense. Do you know, I have set my heart upon that coming to something. No, you needn't shake your head. For very many reasons it would be a most desirable match. For my own part, I believe it was for no other reason that you bothered me into inviting him to join our party here. You are a matchmaker. I challenge you to refute the accusation." "I shall not attempt to do so," she retorted with considerable hauteur. "It is always a waste of time to argue with you. At any rate, you must agree with me that Gertrude would make an ideal duchess." "So you have travelled as far as that, have you?" I inquired. "I must say that you jump to conclusions very quickly, because Glenbarth happens to have said in confidence to me, a confidence I am willing to admit I have shamefully abused, that he considers Gertrude Trevor a very charming girl. It does not follow that he has the very slightest intention of asking her to be his wife. Why should he?" "If he doesn't, he is not fit to sit in the House of Lords," she answered, as if that ought to clench the argument. "Fancy a man posing as one of our hereditary legislators who doesn't know how to seize such a golden opportunity. As a good churchwoman I pray for the nobility every Sunday morning, and if not knowing where to look for the best wife in the world may be taken as a weakness, and it undoubtedly is, then all I can say is that they require all the praying for they can get." "But I should like to know how is he going to marry the best wife in the world?" I asked. "By asking her," she retorted. "He doesn't surely suppose she's going to ask him?" "If he values his life he'd better not do that," I said savagely. He will have to answer for it to me if he does." "Ah," she answered, her lips curling, "I thought as much. You are jealous of him. You don't want him to ask her, because you fancy that if he does your reign will be over. Nice admission for a married man, I must say." "I presume you mean because I refuse to allow him to flirt with my wife." "I mean nothing of the kind, and you know it. How dare you say, Dick, that I flirt with the Duke?" "Because you have confessed it," I answered, with a grin of triumph, for I had got her cornered at last. "Did you not say only a moment ago that if he did not know where to find the best wife in the world he was unfit to sit in the House of Lords? Did you not say that he ought to be ashamed of himself if he did not ask her to be his wife? Answer that, my lady." "I admit I did say it, but you know very well that I referred to Gertrude Trevor." "Gertrude Trevor is not yet a wife. The best wife in the world is beside me now, and since you are already proved to be in the wrong, you must perforce pay the penalty." She was in the act of doing so when Gertrude entered the room. "Oh dear," she began, hesitating in pretended consternation. "Is there never to be an end of it?" "End of what?" demanded my wife with some little asperity, for she does not like her little endearments to be witnessed by other people. "Of this billing and cooing," the other replied. "You two insane creatures have been married more than 4 years, and yet a third person can never enter the room without finding you love making. I declare it upsets all of one's theories of marriage. One of my most cherished ideas was that this sort of thing ceased with the honeymoon, and the couple invariably lead a cat and dog life for the remainder of their existence." "So they do," my wife answered unblushingly. "And what can you expect when one is a great silly creature who will not learn to jump away and be looking innocently out of the window when he hears the handle turned? Never marry, Gertrude. Mark my words, you will repent it if you do." "Well, for ingratitude and cool impudence that surpasses everything," I said in astonishment. "Why, you audacious creature, not more than 5 minutes ago you were inviting me to co-operate in the noble task of finding a husband for Miss Trevor." "Richard, how can you stand there and say such things?" she ejaculated. "Gertrude, my dear, I insist that you come away at once. I don't know what he will say next." Miss Trevor laughed. "I like to hear you two squabbling," she said. "Please go on. It amuses me." "Yes, I will certainly go on," I returned. "Perhaps you heard her declare that she fears what I might say next." "Of course she does. Allow me to tell you, Lady Hatteras, that you are a coward. If the truth were known, it would be found that you are trembling in your shoes at this moment. For 2 centimes paid down, I would turn Queen's evidence and reveal the whole plot." "You had better not, sir," she replied, shaking a warning finger at me. "In that case the letters from home shall be withheld from you, and you will not know how your son and heir is progressing." "I capitulate," I answered. "Threatened by such awful punishment, I dare say no more. Miss Gertrude, will you not intercede for me?" "I think you scarcely deserve it," she retorted. "Even now you are keeping something back from me." "Never mind, my dear, we'll let him off this time with a caution," said my wife, "providing he promises not to offend again. And now let us settle what we are going to do today." When this important matter had been arranged, it was reported to us that the ladies were to spend the morning shopping, leaving the Duke and myself free to follow our own inclinations. Accordingly, when we had seen them safely on their way to the Merceria, we held a smoking council to arrange how we should pass the hours until lunch time. As we discovered afterwards, we both had a certain thought in our minds, which for some reason we scarcely liked to broach to each other. It was settled, however, just as we desired, but in a fashion we least expected. We were seated in the balcony outside our room, watching the animated traffic on the Grand Canal below, when a servant came in search of us and handed me a note. One glance at the characteristic writing was sufficient to show me that it was from Dr Nikola. I opened it with an eagerness that I did not attempt to conceal, and read as follows: "Dear Hatteras, if you have nothing more important on hand this morning, can you spare the time to come and see me? As I understand, the Duke of Denbath is with you. Will you not bring him also? It will be very pleasant to have a chat upon bygone days, and what is more, I fancy this old house will interest you. Yours very truly, Nikola." "What do you say?" I inquired when I had finished reading. "Shall we go?" "Let us do so by all means," the Duke replied. "It will be very interesting to meet Nikola once more. There is one thing, however, that puzzles me. How did he become aware of my arrival in Venice? You say he was with you on the piazza last night, so that he could not have been at the railway station, and as I haven't been outside since I came, except for the row after dinner, I confess it puzzles me." "You should know by this time that it is useless to wonder how Nikola acquires his knowledge," I replied. "For my own part, I should like to discover his reason for being in Venice. I am very curious on that point." Glenbarth shook his head solemnly. "If Nikola does not want us to know," he argued, "we shall leave his house as wise as we entered it. If he does let us know, I shall begin to grow suspicious, for in that case it's £1,000 to this half-smoked cigar that we should be called upon to render him assistance. However, if you are prepared to run the risk, I will do so also." "In that case," I said, rising from my chair and tossing what remained of my cigar into the water below, "let's get ready and be off. We may change our minds." 10 minutes later we had chartered a gondola and were on our way to the Palace of Revecce. As a general rule, when one sets out to pay a morning call, one is not the victim of any particular nervousness. On this occasion, however, both Glenbarth and I, as we confessed to each other afterwards, were distinctly conscious of being in a condition which would be described by persons of mature years as an unpleasant state of expectancy, but by which schoolboys is denominated funk. The Duke, I noticed, fidgeted with his cigar, allowed it to go out, and then sat with it in his mouth unlighted. There was a far-away look on his handsome face that told me he was recalling some of the events connected with the time when he had been in Nikola's company. This proved to be the case, for as we turned from the Grand Canal into the street in which the palace is situated, he said, "By the way, Hatteras, I wonder what became of Baxter, Prendergast, and those other fellows." "Nikola may be able to tell us," I answered. Then I added after a short pause, "By Jove, what strange times those were!" "Not half so strange to my thinking as our finding Nikola in Venice," Glenbarth replied. "That is the coincidence that astonishes me. See, here we are." As he spoke, the gondola drew up at the steps of the Palace of Revecce, and we prepared to step ashore. As we did so, I noticed that the armorial bearings of the family still decorated the posts on either side of the door. But by the light of day the palace did not look nearly so imposing as it had done by moonlight the night before. One thing about it was certainly peculiar. When we ordered the gondolier to wait for us, he shook his head. Not for anything would he remain there longer than was necessary to set us down. I accordingly paid him off, and when we had descended the steps we entered the building. On pushing open the door we found ourselves standing in a handsome courtyard, in the centre of which was a well, its coping elegantly carved with a design of fruit and flowers. A broad stone staircase at the further end led up to the floor above, but this, as was the case with everything else, showed unmistakable signs of having been allowed to fall into decay. As no concierge was to be seen, and there was no one in sight of whom we might make inquiries, we scarcely knew how to proceed. Indeed, we were just wondering whether we should take our chance and explore the lower regions in search of Nikola, when he appeared at the head of the staircase and greeted us. "Good morning," he said. "Pray come up. I must apologize for not having been downstairs to receive you." By the time he had finished speaking he had reached us, and was shaking hands with Glenbarth with the heartiness of an old friend. "Let me offer you a hearty welcome to Venice," he said to Glenbarth, after he had shaken hands with myself. And looking at him once more, he added, "If you will permit me to say so, you have changed a great deal since we last saw each other." "And you scarcely at all," Glenbarth replied. "Ah, it is strange that I should not have done so," Nikola answered. "I thought a little sadly, for I think I may say without any fear of boasting that since we parted at Pipa-Lannou I have passed through sufficient to change a dozen men. But we will not talk of that here. Let us come up to my room, which is the only place in this great house that is in the least degree comfortable." So saying, he led the way up the stairs, and then along a corridor which had once been beautifully frescoed, which was now sadly given over to damp and decay. At last reaching a room in the front of the building, he threw open the door and invited us to enter. And here I might digress for a moment to remark that of all the men I have ever met, Nikola possessed the faculty of being able to make himself comfortable wherever he might be, in the greatest degree. He would have been at home anywhere. As a matter of fact, this particular apartment was finished in a style that caused me considerable surprise. The room itself was large and lofty, while the walls were beautifully frescoed, the work of one Andrea Bunopelli, of whom I shall have more to say anon. The furniture was simple, but extremely good. A massive oak writing table stood beside one wall, another covered with books and papers was opposite it. Several easy chairs were placed here and there. Another table in the centre of the room supported various chemical paraphernalia, while books of all sorts and descriptions, in all languages and bindings, were to be discovered in every direction. After what you have seen of the rest of the house, this strikes you as being more homelike, does it not? Nikola inquired, as he noticed the look of astonishment upon our faces. It's a queer old place, and the more I see of it, the stranger it becomes. Some time ago, and quite by chance, I became acquainted with its history. I do not mean the political history of the respective families that have occupied it. You can find that in any guidebook. I mean the real inner history of the house itself, embracing not a few of the deeds which have taken place inside its walls. I wonder if you'd be interested if I were to tell you that in this very room, in the year 1511, one of the most repellent and cold-blooded murders of the Middle Ages took place. Perhaps now that you have the scene before you, you would like to hear the story. You would? In that case, pray sit down. Let me offer you this chair, Duke, he continued. And as he spoke, he wheeled forward a handsomely carved chair from beside his writing table. Here, Hatteras, is one for you. I myself will take up my position here, so that I may be better able to retain your attention for my narrative. So saying, he stood between us on the strip of polished floor which showed between the two heavy oriental rugs. For some reasons, he began, I regret that the story I have to tell should run upon such familiar lines. I fancy, however, that the denouement will prove sufficiently original to merit your attention. The year 1509, the same which found the French victorious at Agnadello, and the Venetian Republic of the commencement of that decline from which it has never recovered, saw this house in its glory. The owner, the illustrious Francesco di Revicci, was a sailor, and had the honour of commanding one of the many fleets of the Republic. He was an ambitious man, good fighter, and as such twice defeated the fleet of the League of Camberi. It was after the last of these victories that he married the beautiful daughter of the Duke of Levano, one of the most bitter enemies of the Council of Ten, the husband being rich, famous, and still young enough to be admired for his personal attractions, the bride one of the wealthiest as well as one of the most beautiful women in the Republic. It appeared as if all must be well with them for the remainder of their lives. A series of dazzling fêtes to which all the noblest and most distinguished of the city were invited celebrated their nuptials and their possession of this house. Yet with it all the woman was perhaps the most unhappy individual in the universe. Unknown to her husband and her father, she had long since given her love elsewhere. She was passionately attached to young Andrea Bunopelli, the man by whom the frescoes of this room were painted. Finding that fate demanded her renunciation of Bunopelli and her marriage to Revicci, she resolved to see no more of the man to whom she had given her heart. Love, however, proved stronger than her sense of duty, and while her husband, by the order of the Senate, had put to sea once more in order to drive back the French who were threatening the Adriatic, Bunopelli put into operation the scheme that was ultimately to prove their mutual undoing. Unfortunately for Revicci, he was not successful in his venture, and by news reached Venice that his fleet had been destroyed and that he himself had been taken prisoner. Now, said the astute Bunopelli, is the time to act. He accordingly took pens, paper, and his inkhorn, and in this very room concocted a letter which purported to bear the signature of the commander of the French forces into whose hands the Venetian admiral had fallen and then was. Its meaning was plain enough. It proved that for a large sum of money Revicci had agreed to surrender the Venetian fleet, and in order to secure his own safety, in the case the Republic should lay hands on him afterwards, it was supposed that he himself had only been taken prisoner after a desperate resistance, as had really been the case. The letter was written, and that night the painter himself dropped it into the lion's mouth. Revecce might return now as soon as he pleased. His fate was prepared for him. Meanwhile the guilty pair spent the time as happily as it was possible under the circumstances, knowing full well that should the man against whom they had plotted return to Venice, it would only be to find himself arrested, and with the certainty, on the evidence of the incriminating letter, of being immediately condemned to death. Weeks and months went by. At last Revecce, worn almost to a skeleton by reason of his long imprisonment, did manage to escape. In the guise of a common fisherman he returned to Venice, reached his own house, where a faithful servant recognised him and admitted him to the palace. From the latter's lips he learnt all that had transpired during his absence, and was informed of the villainous plot that had been prepared against him. His wrath knew no bounds, but with it all he was prudent. He was aware that if his presence in the city were discovered, nothing could save him from arrest. He accordingly hid himself in his own house and watched the course of events. What he saw was sufficient to confirm his worst suspicion. His wife was unfaithful to him, and her paramour was the man to whom he had been so kind a friend and so generous a benefactor. Then, when the time was ripe, assisted by only his servant, the same who admitted him to his house, he descended upon the unhappy couple. Under threats of instant death he extorted from them a written confession of their treachery. After having made them secure, he departed for the council chamber and demanded to be heard. He was the victim of a conspiracy, he declared, and to prove that what he said was true, he produced the confession he had that day obtained. He had many powerful friends, and by their influence an immediate pardon was granted him, while permission was also given to him to deal with his enemies as he might consider most desirable. He accordingly returned to this house with a scheme that he was prepared to put into instant execution. It is not a pretty story, but it certainly lends an interest to this room. The painter he imprisoned here. He pressed a spring in the wall. So saying, Nikola stopped and drew back one of the rugs to which I have already referred. The square outline of a trapdoor showed itself in the floor. He pressed a spring in the wall behind him, and the lid shot back, swung round and disappeared, showing the black abyss below. A smell of damp vaults came up to us, and then, when he had closed the trapdoor again, Nikola drew the carpet back to its old position. The wretched man died slowly of starvation in that hole, and the woman, having in this room above, was compelled to listen to his agony without being permitted the means of saving him. Can you imagine the scene? The dying wretch below, doing his best to die like a man in order not to distress the woman he loved, and the outraged husband calmly pursuing his studies, regardless of both. He looked from one to the other of us, and his eyes burnt like living coals. It was brutish, it was hellish, cried Glenbarth, upon whom either the story or Nikola's manner of narrating it had produced an extraordinary effect. Why did the woman allow it to continue? Was she mad that she did not summon assistance? Surely the authorities of a state which prided itself upon its enlightenment, even in those dark ages, would not have tolerated such a thing. You must bear in mind the fact that the Republic had given the husband permission to avenge his wrongs, said Nikola very quietly. Besides, the woman could not cry out, for the reason that her tongue had been torn out at the roots. When both were dead, their bodies were tied together and thrown into the canal, and the same day Revecce set sail again, to ultimately perish in a storm off the coast of Sicily. Now you know one of the many stories connected with this old room. There are others in which that trapdoor has played an equally important part. I fear, however, that none of them can boast so dramatic a setting as that I have just narrated to you. How, knowing all this, you can live in the house passes my comprehension, gasped Glenbarth. I don't think I am a coward, but I tell you candidly that I would not spend a night here after what you have told me, anything the world could give me. But surely you don't suppose that what happened in this room upwards of 300 years ago could have any effect upon a living being today?" said Nikola, with what I could not help thinking was a double meaning. "Let me tell you that far from being unpleasant, it has decided advantages. As a matter of fact, it gives me the opportunity of being free to do what I like. That is my greatest safeguard. I can go away for 5 years, if I please, and leave the most valuable of my things lying about, and come back to the discovery that nothing is missing. I am not pestered by tourists who ask to see the frescoes, for the simple reason that the guides take very good care not to tell them the legend of the house, lest they may be called upon to take them over it. Many of the gondoliers will not stop here after nightfall, and the few who are brave enough to do so invariably cross themselves before reaching and after leaving it." "I don't wonder at it," I said. "Taken altogether, it's the most dismal dwelling I have ever set foot in. Do you mean to tell me you live alone in it?" "Not entirely," he replied. "I have companions, an old man who comes in once a day to attend to my simple wants, and my ever faithful friend." "Apollyon!" I cried, forestalling what he was about to say. "Exactly, Apollyon. I am glad to see that you remember him." He uttered a low whistle, and a moment later the great beast that I remembered so well stalked solemnly into the room and began to rub himself against the leg of his master's chair. "Poor old fellow," continued Nikola, picking him up and gently stroking him. "He is growing very feeble. Perhaps it is not to be wondered at, for he is already far past the average age of the feline race. He has been in many strange places and seen many queer things since we last met, but never anything much stranger than he had witnessed in this room." "What do you mean?" I inquired. "What has the cat seen in this room that's so strange?" "Objects that we are not yet permitted to see," Nikola answered gravely. "When all is quiet at night, when I am working at that table, he lies curled up in yonder chair. For a time he will sleep contentedly, and I see him lift his head and watch something or somebody, I cannot say which, moving about the room. At first I came to the conclusion it must be a bat or some night bird, but that theory exploded. Bats do not remain in the same exact distance from the floor, nor do they stand stationary behind a man's chair for any length of time. The hour will come, however, when it will be possible for us to see these things. I am on the track even now." Had I not known Nikola, and if I had not remembered some very curious experiments he had performed for my special benefit 2 years before, I should have inclined to the belief that he was boasting. I knew him too well, however, to deem it possible that he would waste his time in such an idle fashion. "Do you mean to say," I asked, "that you really think that in time it will be possible for us to see things which at present we have no notion of, that we shall be able to look into the world we have always been taught to consider unknowable?" "I do mean it," he replied, "and though you may scarcely believe it, it was for the sake of information necessary to that end that I pestered Mr. Wetherell in Sydney, imprisoned you in Port Said, and carried the lady, who is now your wife, away to the island in the South Seas." "This is most interesting," I said, while Glenbarth drew his chair a little closer. "Pray tell us some of your adventures since we last saw you," he put in. "You may imagine how eager we are to hear them." Thereupon Nikola furnished us with a detailed description of all that he had been through since that momentous day when he had obtained possession of the stick that had been bequeathed to Mr. Wetherell by China Pete. He told us how, armed with his talisman, he had set out for China, where he engaged a man named Bruce, who must have been as plucky as Nikola himself, and together they started off in search of an almost unknown monastery in Thibet. He described with a wealth of exciting detail the perilous adventures they had passed through, and how near they had been to losing their lives in the attempting to obtain possession of a certain curious book in which were set forth the most wonderful secrets relating to the laws of life and death. He told us of their hairbreadth escapes on the journey back to civilization, and showed how they were followed to England by a mysterious Chinaman, whose undoubted mission was to avenge the robbery and to obtain possession of the book. At this moment he paused, and I found an opportunity of asking him whether he had the book in his possession now. "Would you care to see it?" he inquired. "If so, I will show it to you." Our answering in the affirmative, he crossed to his writing table, unlocked a drawer, and took from it a small, curiously bound book, the pages of which were yellow with age, and the writing so faded that it was almost impossible to decipher it. "And now that you have plotted and planned, and suffered so much to obtain possession of this book, what use has it been to you?" I inquired, with almost a feeling of awe, for it seemed impossible that a man could have endured so much for so trifling a return. "In dabbling with such matters," Nikola returned, "one of the first lessons one learns is not to expect immediate results. There is the collected wisdom of untold ages in that little volume, and when I have mastered the secret it contains, I shall, like the eaters of the forbidden fruit, possess a knowledge of all things, good and evil." Replacing the book in the drawer, he continued his narrative, told us of his great attempt to probe the secret of existence, explained to us his endeavour to put new life into a body already worn out by age. "I was unsuccessful in what I set out to accomplish," he said, "but I advanced so far that I was able to restore the man his youth again. What I failed to do was to give him the power of thought or will. It was the brain that was too much for me, that vital part of man without which he is nothing. I have mastered that secret. I shall try again, and then perhaps I shall succeed. But there is much to be accomplished first. Only I know how much." I looked at him in amazement. Was he jesting, or did he really suppose that it was possible for him, or for any other son of man, to restore youth, and by doing so to prolong life perpetually? Yet he spoke with all his usual earnestness, and seemed as convinced of the truth of what he said as if he were narrating some well-known fact. I did not know what to think. At last, seeing the bewilderment on our faces, I suppose, he smiled, and rising from his chair, reminded us that if we had been bored, we had only ourselves to thank for it. He accordingly changed the conversation by inquiring whether we had made any arrangements for that evening. I replied that so far as I knew we had not, whereupon he came forward with a proposition. "In that case," he said, "if you will allow me to act as your guide to Venice, I think I could show you a side of the city you have never seen before. I know her as thoroughly as any man living, and I think I may safely promise you that your party will spend an interesting couple of hours. What have you to say to my proposal?" "Quite sure we shall be delighted," I replied, though not without certain misgivings. "But I think I had better not decide until I have seen my wife. If she has made no other arrangements, at what hour shall we start?" "At what time do you dine?" he inquired. "At 7 o'clock," I replied. "Perhaps we might be able to persuade you to give us the pleasure of your company." "I thank you," he answered, "but I fear I must decline. However, I am hermit-like in my habits so far as meals are concerned. If you will allow me, I will call for you, shall we say 8:30? The moon will have risen by that time, and we should spend a most enjoyable evening." "8:30, I said, "unless you hear to the contrary," and then rose from my chair. Glenbarth followed my example, and we accordingly bade Nikola good bye. Despite our protest, he insisted on accompanying us down the great staircase to the courtyard below, his terrible cat following close upon his heels. Hailing a gondola, we bade the man take us back to our hotel. For some minutes after we had said good bye to Nikola, we sat in silence as the boat skimmed over the placid water. "Well, what is your opinion of Nikola now?" I said, as we turned from the Rio del Consiglio into the Grand Canal once more. "Has he grown any more commonplace, do you think, since you last saw him?" "On the contrary, he is stranger than ever," Glenbarth replied. "I have never met any other man who resembled him in the slightest degree." What a ghastly story that was! His dramatic telling of it made it appear so real that towards the end of it I was almost convinced I could hear the groans of the poor wretch in the pit below, and see the woman wringing her hands and moaning in the room in which we were sitting. Why he should have told it to us is what I cannot understand. Neither can I make out what his reasons can be for living in that house. "Nikola's actions are like himself, entirely inexplicable," he answered. "But that he has some motive beyond the desire he expressed for peace and quiet, I have not the shadow of a doubt." "And now with regard to tonight," said the Duke. "I am afraid, a little pettishly, I was surprised when you accepted his offer. Do you think Lady Hatteras and Miss Trevor will care about such an excursion?" "That is a question I cannot answer at present," I replied. "We must leave it to them to decide. For my own part, I could scarcely imagine anything more interesting. When we reached Galaghetti's, I informed my wife and Miss Trevor of Nikola's offer, half expecting that the latter, from the manner in which she had behaved at the mere mention of his name that morning, would decline to accompany us, and therefore the excursion would fall through. To my surprise, however, she did nothing of the kind. She fell in with the idea at once, and, so far as we could see, without reluctance of any kind. There was nothing for it, therefore, under these circumstances, but for me to fall back upon the old commonplace and declare that women are difficult creatures to understand. End of chapter 2.